Good afternoon. My name is Alfreda Norman, Senior Vice President of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, responsible for the communications and outreach function at the bank. Welcome to our virtual town hall featuring a conversation with Dallas Fed President Rob Kaplan and moderated by Stacy-Marie Ishmael, Editorial Director for the Texas Tribune. Before we dive into the program, I want to set the stage for why we're here. The new world of social distancing caused by the coronavirus has compelled the bank to use technology to continue connecting with the public during this difficult time. While we have been actively engaging with many people this year, albeit virtually, we wanted to expand our outreach to include opportunities for the public to ask questions directly of Rob. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Rob Kaplan and Stacy-Marie Ishmael. Rob has served as the 13th president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas since 2015. He represents the 11th Federal Reserve District on the Federal Open Market Committee in the formulation of U.S. monetary policy and oversees the 1,200 employees of the Dallas Fed. Stacy-Marie is editorial director of the Texas Tribune. Prior to that, she was senior editor at Apple, managing editor for mobile at BuzzFeed News, and vice president of communities at the Financial Times. In this session, Rob will start with an opening statement. Then we'll sit for a moderated conversation with Stacy, which will include time for questions from you, our audience. There are two ways to submit a question. To submit a written question, click the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window to open the question box. If you'd like to ask a live question, click the raised hand button to enter the queue and wait to be called upon. You will be prompted to unmute your microphone and ask your question. We ask that you keep your questions as concise as possible and be sure to ask only one question to allow time for others. Without further ado, let's turn to Rob for his opening remarks.
All right, thank you, Alfreda. I appreciate it. And Stacey, who we'll hear in a few minutes, thank you for doing this. We're thrilled to have you here. So let me just make a few comments to sort of set the table as to what's going on in the U.S. economy this year and what the outlook might be. So as has been well publicized and you all know, the U.S. economy contracted in the second quarter of this year by in the neighborhood of 32 or 33% annualized. And when I say annualized, I mean multiply by 4. And so we had a very severe downturn. But as severe as it was, our best judgment at the Dallas Fed is the U.S. economy bottomed out sometime in April. We began to grow again in May and again in June. And then around mid-June, the rate of growth started to stall out a bit, mainly because of resurgence of the virus in the United States. And that was certainly true in Texas, but it was true generally in the US. And in all our mobility and engagement indices, all our high frequency data we look at, we saw a stalling out in mobility. And that went on until sometime in August. And we started to see mobility and engagement improve. And again, highly correlated to the incidence of the virus in the United States. With all those fits and starts, though, it's our view at the Dallas Fed that the third quarter is going to wind up growing at approximately 30% annualized. And it may be a little higher than that. So we had a very deep decline in the second quarter. We've had a steep rebound in the third quarter. It would have been even steeper, but for the resurgence of the virus. It was substantially aided by fiscal policy, and I'll explain that in a moment. Our best judgment is that in the fourth quarter, the U.S. economy is going to grow somewhere between 6 and 9%. So we're going to have a solid rate of growth in the fourth quarter. We're going to end this year, when we look back, with a contraction for the year of something in the neighborhood of 2.5%. And if you talked to me a month ago, we would have thought the contraction for the year would have been worse. So our forecasts for the year are firming. but we think about a 2.5% contraction, and we'll end the year in the United States with an unemployment rate of something between 7 and 7.5%. The unemployment rate right now is 7.9%. And the better indicator that we look at, we refer to in the lingo as U6, which is unemployed plus discouraged workers plus people working part-time who would prefer to work full-time. And that percent is 12 and a fraction. That's a better indicator of people either being unemployed or not being able to get enough hours. And so we've still got a very high level of unemployment in the United States. And again, it will improve between now and the end of the year. And going into next year, it's our best judgment that the U.S. economy will grow by approximately 3.5% next year. So very healthy rate of growth. And again, we'll be climbing out of this hole that we're in. And we think we'll continue to grind down the rate of unemployment for all of next year. Okay, so having said all that, let me talk about 2 or 3 elements of this pandemic and what we're going through that are unusual or notable, worth looking at. First of all, as you in the audience are well aware, this crisis has affected different types of businesses in a different way. So obviously, if you're a business that is in the person-to-person service sector, you've seen a meaningful decline in your business. And I talk to a broad range of small, mid-sized, and large businesses every week. And for those that are in the person-to-person contact-related business, which is either restaurants, leisure, entertainment, airlines, and so on, movie theaters, they've seen some improvement, but they are well off where we were a year ago. And for many of those businesses, especially the small businesses, they took the PPP. Many of them are in the process of getting loan forgiveness, but this is still a very difficult time for those businesses. On the other hand, if you're in a business where you're able to work remotely, it does not rely on person-to-person contact, you may actually be seeing your business having rebounded back to levels that are in the range of pre-pandemic levels. And if you're in certain industries, home improvement and other businesses, you're likely seeing a very healthy rebound. And if anybody goes into home improvement stores knows what I'm talking about. And so what's happened, which is unusual for a downturn, normally when you have a severe downturn like the one we had in the second quarter, consumer income would decline dramatically and consumer spending would decline. That has not happened in this downturn. Even though the economy contracted, consumer income has stayed relatively stable and consumer spending has been strong. And in fact, at times has outpaced where it was pre-pandemic. So why has that happened? A big part of that reason that's happened is fiscal policy, and particularly unemployment benefits, which have allowed consumers and those that have lost their jobs or can't get enough hours, it's allowed them to maintain their incomes and maintain their spending. And so what's happened is that while certain sectors have lost revenue and have lost GDP, the economy hasn't lost that GDP. What we've seen is the GDP has shifted to other sectors that are less sensitive to person-to-person contact. And this is the reason why I mentioned the decline for the year, the contraction for 2020 in the United States of about 2.5%. That is materially better than most other countries in the world. And a big part of the difference is fiscal policy in the United States. We've outperformed, and that's a big reason why. We haven't necessarily managed the virus better than other countries, but we've had substantial fiscal policy that most other countries have not had. So let me make a one last comment. One of the things about this pandemic that's concerning is the way it's disproportionately impacted different members of the population. And what do I mean by that? If you've got a college education or higher, there's a good chance that you're able to work remotely. And it's likely, based on the numbers we look at, you may not have lost, you're less likely to have lost your job, and you probably haven't lost significant income. If, on the other hand, you're a person with high school or less level of educational attainment, it is far more likely that you're working in a person-to-person contact industry. You don't have the option to work remotely. It is far more likely that you've lost your job. And if you haven't lost your job, it's far more likely that you've lost income. And we see this as being particularly pronounced in the labor statistics and the income statistics. And related to that, another group that jumps out at you when you look at the statistics is women with a high school education or less who have fared far worse than their male counterparts. And it's not only what I just talked about in terms of the professions they're in being more likely to be person-to-person contact, but also because kids often are not able to be in school. Many women have been forced to stay at home, to withdraw from the labor force. And we see that in the statistics, and it's concerning. So what do I take from all that? I think as we come out of this pandemic and we weather it, we're going to have a lot of work to do to get these underrepresented groups that have been disproportionately affected back into the labor force. And what does that mean? It stresses the importance of childcare, which has been challenged during this pandemic, but it shows how important childcare is in order to allow women to be in the workforce. We need to really continue to beef up skills training, because many of the folks that have lost their jobs may not have a business to go back to, and may in fact have to go to a new profession or certainly a new employer, and they're going to need retraining. And it also reminds us with the dramatic acceleration in this pandemic of technology and technology-enabled disruption and the need to be able to function digitally. We're going to have to invest more in addressing the digital divide, i.e. places in our district and our country that don't have good access to Wi-Fi. We're going to have to address that. And maybe a lot of that can be done actually not with government money, but with private sector money in partnership with local nonprofits, but that needs to be improved. And we're going to have to go back and continue to beef up and improve early childhood literacy, half-day versus full-day pre-K, improving educational attainment, because these trends we're seeing in the economy with technology and technology-enabled disruption are accelerating, and workers there's going to be a premium on workers being more adaptable, more literate, in order to adjust to a world where technology and technology-enabled disruption is changing the nature of jobs and putting a greater onus on adaptability of the workforce. So I guess that's a very quick and brief overview and a thumbnail sketch. And with that, I'll stop, and we can go much deeper on a lot of these points, and I'll turn it over to Stacy.
Hi, this is Stacy-Marie Ishmael from the Texas Tribune, and for some reason, I don't know if folks can see my video, it seems to have decided to stop working. But in the meantime, while we figure out why that's not working, thank you, Rob, for that overview and that introduction. I wanted to take this opportunity to, as you say, go a little bit deeper on some of the things that you've discussed. I particularly, I'm going to plug the Texas Tribune Festival for a second that just finished happening in September. And at the time you said you had a great conversation with Joe Wiesenthal of Bloomberg, And there's a phrase that you use, which you emphasize here again, which was, because credit conditions are relatively loose, unless you are a small or mid-sized business, particularly in that person-to-person contact industry, we may need more rounds of PPP. Do you have a sense of what that additional stimulus could or should look like, and what kind of effects that might particularly have for folks in Texas who are in these industries and are struggling?
So you said it. You said it well. On the one hand, financial conditions are relatively loose, and if you're a company with access to the public markets, you've got good access to capital at attractive rates. If, on the other hand, you're a small mid-sized business, particularly in a person-to-person contact industry, those businesses are struggling, and I can tell you from direct conversation. And many of them use the PPP, but they've already are in the process, either have gotten the loan forgiven or they're in the process of getting forgiveness. They brought their workers back, and now, particularly with the resurgence of the virus and fears of resurgence into the fall, many of them are very worried that whether they're going to survive this.
Yep.
And they need more help. And a number of them have already made the decision that they may not make it and have already closed down, or finding some other avenue to exit the business or combine with a larger company. But for many of them, a second round of the PPP, meaning an additional loan with forgiveness, much like the first PPP, if they're gonna survive, they may well need a second round of that. And the problem, and a typical conversation I'm having with many of those businesses are how much longer is this going to go on for? And I might be able to make it for a few more months, but if social distancing continues, even with the vaccine, and my business doesn't come back, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to make it beyond a few months. And that's a typical conversation. So that's where a new round of the PPP would make a difference.
One of the interesting things that I've seen, and we've certainly seen this in our reporting at the Tribune, is how the conversation among folks, and particularly small business owners, has started to shift away from, there's still questions about whether there's a crisis of leadership in navigating the coronavirus, but people are also now starting to think, okay, what do we do about demand? Right? If folks are not showing up to those movie theaters, if people are not dining in, or they're having smaller tabs if they do dine in, how do we navigate that if there's a demand crisis?
Well, so here's the challenging part of this. Again, as I said, up to now, it's not that consumer spending has gone away; it's just shifted.
Everybody DIYing.
And so the demand is there. The question that everybody's wrestling with is how much of it is going to shift back, and how much of it is just facing reality. This is a change in the structure of the economy, and our business just isn't going to be what it was. And the truth is, we'll know the answer to that in hindsight. And so the challenge, probably as policymakers, and a challenge for businesses, is if the world has just simply changed and it's not going to change back, this is part of the capitalist process where businesses start, businesses fail, workers need to move jobs. And part of that is it's painful, but it's a natural part of the evolution. And then how much of this is, it's temporary, and yeah, the world has changed, but it's a product of the resurgence of the virus. And that's where a lot of the debate comes, which there's both of those things going on, and policymakers are struggling, and businesses are struggling to figure out and judge which is which. And it's hard to know the precise answer.
And, not to go all in the long run, we're all dead, but I think the challenge with figuring that out is for the businesses that are hurting right now, how, they can't necessarily afford to wait it out, which adds a kind of additional urgency to that need for additional stimulus of some kind. Flipping for a second into that medium to long term, one of the things you've been a really passionate advocate of is and this is all pre-coronavirus and pre-pandemic, the need to rethink skills and the constitution of the labor force, and to really, particularly here in Texas, like really aggressively beef up early childhood education and efforts around different kinds of learning. You know, I read that you remarked that people just have to get used to this idea that you are like continuous learning is going to be or needs to be the rule rather than the exception. How have the trends that you're seeing with employment, with labor force participation, particularly in those like less educated or less skilled groups, changed your mind on this or actually deepened your conviction about this being a path forward?
So it's deepened my conviction on it. And so there were two trends pre-pandemic that we talked a lot about. One is the population in the United States is aging. I wish it wasn't, but it is. And workforce growth is slowing. Okay. And that those trends are intensifying. That's not, we're not going back on that. And then the second issue is, despite all this spending on technology and new, more efficient ways to do things, we're not seeing the improvement in productivity that you'd expect. So why is that? And I think what we've concluded is, if you got to get back to this demarcation, if you got a college education or greater, you probably are pretty well equipped to adapt to technology and technology-able disruption because you're more adaptable. You may still, even you may need additional training and a new certificate, but you've got the skills to do it. But we're finding if you've got a high school education or less, which is 46 million out of a 160 million person workforce, technology and disruption are increasingly causing your job to either be restructured or eliminated. And the capitalist dream is turning out to be pretty painful for you. And that, yeah, you hear the economy's doing better, but you're getting buffeted around by this. So I said that pre-pandemic, and what the pandemic has done is accelerated the trend of technology replacing people and technology-enabled disruption. So there's going to be a premium here related to this on further dramatically beefing up skills training. People are going to have to get trained and retrained in their lives. And number two, a more adaptable workforce, and that starts with literacy. High percentage of kids in Texas, for example, are starting first grade reading behind grade level. 25% of children in this state are growing up in poverty. It's highly correlated. And yet that's the workforce of the future. And so back to what drives GDP, if we don't improve their early childhood literacy, food insecurity, the digital divide, and improve educational attainment, we're going to wind up having a less productive workforce in the years ahead, and we're going to grow more slowly. So it's in all of our interests. If you want a vibrant economy, we need to do more, and we need to catch it in years 0 to 5. We need to catch it at the front end and improve the whole ecosystem, early childhood literacy, secondary education, and beefed up skills training. May mean or may not mean college, but we need to improve the whole ecosystem, and we'll have a better workforce, and that means we'll have stronger GDP growth.
Your earlier point about, women having to opt out or being required to opt out of the workforce because of the constraints of childcare, but also because of the constraints of trying to be a teacher in the context of that kind of education. I've been really amazed by the intersection of folks who don't have Wi-Fi or fast internet at home also trying to take these online classes while also trying to file for unemployment benefits. It's just like the collision of these things that you're describing in a way that's really quite traumatic for people. How do you see, to your earlier point about, is this just a structural seismic change, the effects of this on folks affecting their decisions about how they might want to participate in this workforce in the future?
Well, the tragedy of this is if you roll forward up through February of this year, we were seeing good progress in closing the gap. We saw improving wages. We saw the divergence between high school and less and those with higher levels of education, we saw good gains among those groups, including women. Women with a high school education or less was one of the biggest gainers. That group was one of the biggest gainers. The unemployment rate for Blacks and Hispanics also was converging, and the gap was closing with the overall unemployment rate. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we've taken a big step back again. And what's a little, more than a little alarming is when you compare these unemployment statistics and labor participation statistics with those at the height of the Great Recession, you see that these underrepresented groups are faring even worse.
Yep.
And women with a high school education or less is a good example where this is unique to this downturn. And so my job and our job, I think, is to call it out, call attention to it. Again, some of this can be addressed not necessarily with government money, maybe businesses, nonprofits, local communities. I think there's a lot we can do and are doing to address these things, but it starts with calling out the issue and making people aware of it, because a lot of people are not aware of what's going on right now in these divergences. And the last thing is, I think part of my job is to connect this. This is not just a nice thing to do. If you want to grow faster and have a healthier economy, we need to find ways to get these underrepresented groups back into the workforce and productive, because we'll grow faster and we'll do better if we can address those issues.
One of the other ways in which we may, address an aging labor force and an aging population generally is through immigration. And I'm interested in your perspective on whether and to what extent kind of the current immigration policy in the United States is enabling some of that workforce substitution that we may need in the coming years.
Yeah. So leading up, again, right before the pandemic, for those who listen to me talk or read essays we wrote here at the Dallas Fed, we talked in almost every one about immigration. And I pointed out that in the last 20 years, over half the workforce growth in the United States came from immigrants and their children, and that we believed in the next 20 years, that percentage is going to be closer to 100%. And why do we know that? Because native-born workforce growth is going to be negative due to aging.
Right.
And so I talked a lot about immigration. I haven't talked about immigration that much in the last 8 months. And part of the reason is our problem at the moment right now is not workforce growth. It's getting our existing workforce back employed again. And so the only comment I'll make is we're going to spend likely all of 2021 and 2022 and then into 2023 getting back on track and again to where we can approach full employment again, i.e. getting to an unemployment rate of 4% or below may not happen until sometime in 2023. As we approach that, this immigration issue is going to be more vital because, again, we're going to be disappointed in those years that our potential growth rate is sluggish. So before the pandemic, we were growing around 1 3/4, 2% a year. I think our thought that potential growth was 1 3/4, 2%. Because of aging and slow workforce growth, unless we improve productivity through beefed up education, it's likely that our potential growth rate is going to slip further, i.e. below 1 3/4%, unless we find ways again to grow the workforce and improve productivity. So immigration and appropriate immigration, and we've talked here, we've done a lot of research on what Canada has done, which is more skills-based immigration.
Skills visas, yep.
That's going to be an important topic if you want to grow faster. And listen, if we were not so highly leveraged and we didn't have so much debt as a country at the federal government level, that would be one thing. But we're now approaching 100% of debt held by the public of GDP. We were in the high 70s pre-pandemic, and the present value of unfunded entitlements is now, over $60 trillion. We've got to find ways to grow faster if we're going to, that'll be one of the elements of moderating our debt to GDP growth. And so this is a critical subject.
To that point, it does sound like you have, I think, appropriate concerns about, debt to GDP relative to the potential for that slow growth rate. How are you kind of analytically or from a personal perspective squaring that with the need for additional stimulus and how that stimulus might be funded?
So pre-pandemic, my view, and I've said this publicly many times, is that the path of U.S. government debt was likely not sustainable. And the only reason we're able to manage it as we have been is the dollar is the world's reserve currency, and people around the world overweight to the dollar, and makes our debt and this amount of debt financeable. What we've done in the pandemic, which I agree with, by the way, what we've done is we needed to put that aside for a moment and use monetary and fiscal policy to try to limit the scarring from this pandemic. But as we, God willing, address the pandemic and get beyond it and weather it and are back on track to growing again, we're going to have to get back to, we're going to have to grow faster. And this is away from monetary policy, and I'll leave it to other, we're going to have to look at, I'm sure, entitlements, and we're going to have to look at all the aspects of fiscal policy, and we're going to have to find ways to grow faster to moderate this debt growth. And the importance of that is even more now than it was pre-pandemic, because we're more highly leveraged. And again, I'm hopeful that the dollar will remain the world's reserve currency for the foreseeable future, but I think it'd be a mistake to rely so heavily on that presumption.
I think one of the things that folks have found particularly challenging in terms of that balance is trying to project where that necessary growth might come from, right? Because some of what we've described are, again, they're not immediate fixes. What, from your perspective, are what are the bright spots for you, other than the fact that everyone is renovating their home offices, particularly in Texas? And what do you see, whether in terms of the Abbott administration's policy or just the conversations that you're having with folks around where we're seeing an appropriate level of leadership and creativity and innovation around what these immediate solutions, or at least bombs, might be?
Well, it's my view that a lot of people worry about, gee, will there be enough growth with technology-enabled disruption, and will there be enough jobs? And my own view is the answer is yes. The challenge will be the nature of the jobs will be different. The degree of training to do those jobs will be different. And our education system is going to have to adapt to those changes. But I think pre-pandemic is a good example. Technology-enabled disruption was raging, and yet we got down to an unemployment rate of 3.5%, and there were lots of underrepresented groups being pulled in, and companies just couldn't find workers. I think we can get back to that, but the part that's going to be troubling is not whether there'll be enough jobs. It's the overall level of growth is going to be disappointing, and it gets back to these basics: growing the workforce and improving their productivity, and doing all the things I talked about. It may also include infrastructure spending to help improve productivity. But we'll have enough growth, and we'll have enough work, I'm convinced, for there to be enough jobs. What I'm more concerned about is, will the education system catch up to allow people to be more adaptable through their entire career and through their lives? I believe it can, and we're spending an enormous amount of time in this district talking about it with political leaders, business leaders, junior high school superintendents, junior college presidents, and so on, university presidents. We can do this, but we're going to have probably significant changes in the way in our education system to improve the whole ecosystem.
And with that, I'd love to segue a little bit into some of the questions that we've had from folks. This is clearly a fascinating and highly engaged audience. I just want to keeping on this theme of education, does investing in, right now there are a lot of voices calling for industry specific stimulus, right? Like airlines, restaurants, even movie theaters. From your perspective, is that more or less likely to trigger the kind of growth that you are hopeful to achieve than, say, these kinds of investments in education, for example?
So those judgments, which are all fiscal policy, not monetary policy, about how to allocate resources, I'll stay away from. And I know there's debates on both sides. How involved should the government be? How much should it allow the capitalist process to work this through versus how much of this is an exogenous shock, extraordinary shock, and we ought to be using fiscal policy to smooth over some of those shocks. I think all those judgments need to be made. I'll stay away from that debate. To me, beneath the hood, if you're going to get fundamental growth in the overall economy, I'm convinced we're going to have to improve ways to grow the workforce. We're going to have to improve productivity, I think heavily through education and skills training. We're going to have to make investments in infrastructure, particularly things like Wi-Fi, to make it more accessible. I think all those investments will help us raise potential growth. And then I'll leave it to others to decide, where resources go between industries. But I'm convinced that these more fundamental investments are going to be very critical.
We have a lot of questions on those fundamentals, and so I'm going to ask, on behalf of Warren and various other folks in the chat, if you are willing to share a little bit more of your outlook that you alluded to in your opening remarks on unemployment in Texas, the growth rates, and especially your outlook for inflation and the degree to which the policies that we have right now are sufficiently accommodative. And then
so let's take them one piece at a time. First, let's talk about Texas. And the story of Texas over the last 15 or 20 years has been migration of people and firms from outside the U.S. as well as inside the U.S. to the state. Population growth in Texas has been outstripping the nation. We had 22 and a fraction million people here 10 years ago. We're pushing up to 29 million, and we think the population of this state is going to grow over the next 20 years, is continue to grow and outgrow the rest of the country. And I will tell you, in the aftermath of this pandemic, we're seeing dramatically more inquiry and migration of people and firms to the state. I've been pretty much struck by every few days I'm having conversations with somebody in Illinois, California, East Coast that is actively thinking about not only coming here themselves, but bringing their business and their teams with them. And so Texas is going to do very, very well, in my opinion. The state has become dramatically more diversified. I think we'll get even more diversified. Many people talk about the energy business, and it's critical to the state, but it's in the neighborhood of 8% of the state's GDP. That's a dramatic drop from what it might have been 10 or 15 years ago. And so the trends are for Texas to outperform the nation. And I think we're seeing that this year, in that I would guess that job growth and the performance here in Texas will again outstrip the nation, even though we've had our own challenges at various times with managing the virus. I think Texas is positioned to do very, very well. And there you are, Stacy. Welcome.
I'm back.
Okay, good. Sorry about that.
On that very optimistic note about Texas's positioning, my camera has decided to work. On that point about Texas versus the country, are there any other interesting state-specific trends that you might be seeing that are surprising, or actually that you're just kind of pleased about?
So here's something I've been worried about, and I'm probably more concerned about. I mentioned slow population growth because of an aging population. So what's happening? There's an increasing battle between the states for people. Mm-hmm. What's the most valuable thing a city or a state can have? People and population growth. And So we're seeing a number of trends. I think that tension is intensifying.
Yep.
One of the things that happened as a result of the pandemic, you and I have talked about, is states have a revenue hole from the second quarter. Even if they've rebounded, they've got to balance their budgets. And a lot of states in the country and governors I talk to are struggling with how are we going to do that?
Mm-hmm.
We're going to have to make cutbacks, and some of them are looking at revenue increases. And some of those revenue increases are triggering members of their population to move. And they're moving toward places like Texas. So I'm nervous that you're getting these population shifts and tension, and it's a symptom of slowing population growth. And that I think if you had better population growth, there'd be a bigger pie for everyone. But I think you're going to have, this is putting strain on states and cities. There's no doubt. And there are other trends, but that's probably the one that's most significant.
When I hear folks in Texas talk about the strain on Texas resources, a topic that often comes up is water and kind of environmental considerations.
Yes.
And there is, because of that population growth and part because of what's been happening with oil prices, I feel like there's a renewed discussion around renewables and green energy and the potential for investments in these things in the state. Do you see Texas having an opportunity to, one, potentially revitalize the employment situation in the parts of the country and the parts of Texas specifically that have been really hit hard by what's happening with oil prices, and in general to just diversify the state economy a little bit more?
Yeah, listen, we wrote an essay, I guess it was about a year ago, about trends in the energy business and renewables and alternatives. And people around the country might be surprised to know that Texas is a leader in solar. It's a leader in wind. They're also probably surprised to know that many of the leading energy companies are actively looking at ways to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions footprint, sequestration, and other trends. And the reason that we're very focused on this also in Texas is a lot of the negative impacts of global warming or climate change are affecting us in hurricanes, drought, flooding. We don't have the fires that California does, but we're seeing with greater frequency these very significant tail events, and they're very expensive. So yeah, I think alternative energy. Listen, the world on the one hand, we've said this based on our estimates, is going to be needing to consume fossil fuels for decades to come. Mm-hmm. Having said that, we're likely to reach peak oil demand globally here in the not too distant future, but that doesn't mean there won't be significant demand for fossil fuels. There will be. So the Permian Basin and energy production, oil and gas production, is going to have a key role. But there's an enormous business opportunity to grow renewables. Many of existing energy companies are diversifying and will take advantage of it. But I think it's a huge business opportunity, and we're probably going to need all of the above. So it's a big opportunity for the United States. It's a big opportunity for Texas. And I can tell you, people in the industry, and certainly people outside the industry, are very focused on it, but people in the industry, based on all our conversations, are very focused on these developments and repositioning to take advantage of them.
Thank you. That answer managed to combine a response to two questions, one from Robin Mansour and one from Ravi Shakamuri. We have a couple of other questions in the chats, and there's a lot of interest, of course, in your perspective on the recent forward guidance. I noticed in your, in the essay that you published a couple of weeks ago, you talked a little bit about the utility or the disutility of forward guidance in a situation like we're in right now. Would you care to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so let me give the background on this. We had a September Federal Open Market Committee meeting. In that meeting, the Federal Reserve and the Federal Open Market Committee, which I'm a member, published a statement where we said that we're going to keep the current setting of the federal funds rate where it is, 0 to 0.25%. We're going to keep it where it is until we reach full employment, we reach 2% inflation, and we're on track to moderately exceed 2% for some time. I dissented from that decision. It's the first time I've dissented. I don't plan to make a habit of it. But the reason I dissented is I agree that we need to keep the setting of the Fed funds rate where it is until we've weathered this pandemic, until the economy is on track to reach full employment and price stability. However, and I think that could take 2.5, 3 years. However, beyond that point, I would prefer, and I would have preferred for us to allow more flexibility to future committees. And why is that? I'm concerned. Well, I can go through. I can go through more detail. But my two concerns. One is there's a difference between being accommodative and keeping rates at zero.
Yep.
And as we approach full employment and we get beyond this pandemic and start improving, the neutral rate, the equilibrium interest rate, will start to drift up. If we keep rates at zero, it means we're increasing accommodation as we approach those dual goals. Are we sure that we want to actually increase accommodation as the economy is improving and approaching full employment and price stability? And the second issue, which related to it, I worry about excess risk taking.
Yeah.
And I don't need to tell the audience here, if you're an older person, you don't earn on savings. You've got to take more risk. If you're an insurance company, if you're a bank, if you're a pension fund, if you're any market participant, keeping rates at zero, I think, is necessary during the pandemic. But if we do it for a prolonged period of time, it pushes people to take more and more risk. And I believe we saw in March what could happen when market participants are over risked, in that when the market goes down precipitously,
yep,
they got to sell. They're over risked. They've got to sell. And you find out that there's ripple effects, and it caused the markets to seize up, and the Fed had to step in. And so that was my comment on that. I think forward guidance is a very useful tool. I think I support using forward guidance, but the comment I made in the meeting and I made publicly afterwards is the public already expected before the meeting that the Fed funds rate would stay at zero for the next few years. Our public statements have reinforced that. And so there's not a lot of ambiguity about the path of Fed funds rate, at least for the next 2.5, 3 years. That's a long time. And so I question how much benefit do we actually get from enhanced forward guidance, even more forward guidance, whereas the concerns were the ones that I just mentioned. And for me, the risk reward wasn't attractive. It wasn't an attractive balance. There'll be other situations in the future where I think there are significant benefits from forward guidance, but you have to weigh the costs and the benefits. And I didn't see the benefits being sufficient to outweigh the costs.
Thank you. We also have a question from folks around whether you are seeing more or less inflationary or deflationary pressures up to and beyond that point.
All right, so this is an interesting question because there's a number of conflicting forces. One force in the pandemic is supply shortages. So I don't need to tell people listening, there's certain items you go to buy, it costs more money because there are supply constraints. And on the other hand, we've got lots of overcapacity in the US economy and a demand drop. So for example, price of gas is yes, there's supply shortages and supply issues, but we've had a demand shock and overcapacity. And so right now, still headline inflation has been relatively muted. My own view as we get beyond this, the supply issues, not all of them, but many of them will get resolved, and that the market has a funny way when there's supply shortages and prices are higher, people come in and they resolve those shortages. And so I think over the horizon, we're going to have two conflicting forces. As we get closer to full employment and we get tighter labor force, which I hope happens and should happen in the next couple, 3 years, we're going to get more wage pressure. The problem is the other powerful force is technology and technology-enabled disruption, which is accelerating. These big platform companies that can add customers with very little additional costs, they're muting pricing power. And the issue will be, how do those two forces play out? My own guess is, if I had to bet, I don't know, and I'm going to be watching and learning. My guess is inflation may be surprisingly muted in these out years because technology and technology-enabled disruption will be such a powerful force. Now, things can change. You could have regulatory changes, you could have other changes that might alter that balance, but that's the balance I'm watching and will be watching.
Got it. We are going to try to take some live questions from folks in the audience. So while we get folks set up, we have a great question about the census, which is, of course, there's a lot of back and forth on that right now. And this question is a little bit long, so I'm going to summarize it. The latest business formation stats for Q3 are showing that there was just a ton of new business formation, right? At the same time that we have very many people saying this is a really difficult environment to be in as a small business owner without infinite access to credit and to capital. Yeah. How are you, do you have a theory of why we might be seeing this?
Yeah, so there are a lot of existing businesses that if they could wave a magic wand, that either have less debt than they currently do. They wish, oh my Lord, I wish I weren't leveraged, or I'd reconfigure my business. So what's an example? If you're in the restaurant business, digital ordering, investing in technology, so you can do quick, I can pre-order, I can go pick it up, I can do it technologically. That's becoming not a nice to have, it's increasingly becoming a vital to have. If you're at the dairy, we have one of our board members is a Dairy Queen and in this state, and he's explained to me, we have to have this capability. We have to invest more in technology. So what's happening? You have people that are new entrants with fresh capital that can take advantage of some of these opportunities. You have existing businesses, some are struggling to reconfigure, and if they're leveraged, it's really a struggle. And I would say this is capitalism. You know, it may surprise people, and it may even have surprised me when I got in this job, how many millions of jobs are destroyed every year and how many new jobs are created. Millions and millions of jobs get destroyed and new jobs are created. New businesses fail and new businesses start. I've been a little concerned about the lack of dynamism pre-pandemic going into this, and that scale and technology investment have never been more important. But I'd say a lot of what you're seeing, for better or worse, is about capitalism. And that's what makes capitalism very vibrant.
To the point about kind of the vibrancy of capitalism, are you seeing within that, the MEI, the mobility indicator, particular areas where that's ticking up faster than you had expected? Particular industries even?
Well, unfortunately, businesses that can operate digitally are again disrupting, taking share from businesses that don't have a digital capability and operate, basically heavily reliant on person-to-person contact. And so these shifts in GDP I'm talking about, consumer spending hadn't gone away. It's not like a normal downturn where it just drops, and that's not happened. It's shifting. And so it's not surprising that capitalists are either in their existing business or new, entrepreneurs are taking advantage of that. The only thing I'd say in the MEI, which concerns me, is with the research, it tracks pretty darn closely the resurgence or lack of resurgence in the virus. Right. So I would just say in the last week, the index has worsened.
Yep.
Again, doesn't mean that the consumer spending is gone, but it makes it more likely it's going to shift to digital platforms, and these consumers are saying, I'm not going out and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to do it in different ways. I'm going to shift my spending. And that's the most striking thing I'm seeing.
Got it. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Keith Chambers, who has a question. Keith?
He may be on mute.
I have sent him an ask to unmute request.
We're all guilty of it.
Video conference bingo. Okay, while Keith unmutes, I'm gonna ask Jason Leader.
Oh, wow. There's a familiar name.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah. Hey, Jason, how are you?
Doing well, Rob. Good to see you. Hey, a question I had is you mentioned the economy is doing better, or it's doing a little bit better than you would have thought.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is, especially since we hit a fiscal cliff August 1st? Yeah, is it the lag effect of the monetary and fiscal, or is it something else?
Two things. One, yes, to your point, yeah, our what we can gauge, it's not perfect, we can gauge. People got generous benefits and they saved, and they're right now still working off that savings. When that savings runs out, honestly, I think I'd be the first to admit it's hard to tell. And so then the second thing I would say, away from fiscal spending, I think the US population and businesses are highly adaptable and highly resilient. If you had told most businesses, universities, you name it, 9 months ago, this is what they'd be doing, they just would say that not possible, no way.
Yeah.
And so I think this is a little bit of a testament to the adaptability of Americans and American business. And so that's part of it too.
Thank you. Keith, it looks like you're unmuted now.
If there is no further stimulus from Congress, how much of a delay in the recovery do you think there will be?
So, you know, we've tried to model this. Not surprising. You'll still listen. It's hard to tell. And again, this is one of these things. Let me tell you what I'm worried about. Is you may know this a little bit in hindsight, in that normally what happens is if you find the savings runs out, okay, and you start to see consumer income decline, that's not the only thing you're going to see. You're going to start to see businesses realize, oh my Lord, demand is down, okay, including ones that have been doing well, are going to see a drop in demand. And then they're going to start to say, you know what, I think we have too many people. And they're going to start letting people go. And you start, in the lingo, this is referred to as recessionary effects. You start to see a downward spiral. And then the question is, do you catch it early enough to where it's pronounced and embedded enough? You're on a downward spiral that's going to take a real effort to reverse. And honestly, Keith, I don't know when that point's going to happen. We're watching extremely carefully for it. We'll probably know it in hindsight. But in the meantime, our sense is, yeah, I mentioned 2.5% contraction and 7 to 7.5% unemployment rate. Those numbers, your risk that those numbers will be worse, but we could be surprised for how long the tail of the previous stimulus lasts. And that's just an honest answer. I think I'm not certain, and I can't be too precise about it.
Currently, the banking industry is awash in cash and liquidity.
Yeah.
A lot of that is businesses sitting on cash, from drawing lines of credit, deferring projects, PPP loans.
Yeah.
And there has been a significant change in consumer spending and habits.
Yeah.
Retail deposits, retail savings accounts are up. I think I've seen 30-some%. So the consumer has paid down debt, sitting on a lot of cash, which would appear to mitigate any need for further stimulus unless it's targeted.
It does, until those savings start to dwindle. And then you're going to start to see it show up in income, and you'll start to see it show up in spending. I can't tell you precisely when that will happen, but if you have an elevated level of unemployment, which we do, not just the headline unemployment, but the U6 I mentioned earlier, you're going to see it eventually. It's just a question of when. You're going to see it start showing up in income and spending. And that's where you may change the dynamics. This recovery, the dynamics because of fiscal stimulus have been, this is highly unusual. And we probably shouldn't take for granted how unusual it is.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Grayson Brown.
Hi there.
Hi, Grayson.
Hi, I was just curious. So I citing a New York Times article talking about why rate cuts don't help the economy as much anymore.
Right.
I was just curious has deregulation ever led to an overuse and overextension of interest rate cuts? And now that there's a risk of liquidity traps such as ZLB down the road, and negative rate risk, where do we go from here in terms of what we can do to prevent anything from going overboard?
Well, so the first question always asked is, what's the nature of financial conditions right now? And they were beyond tight in March. And in fact, we had market dysfunction. And you saw what the Fed did, quickly drop the Fed funds rate from over a few meetings from 1.5 to 1 3/4 to 0. And we instituted these 13-3 programs and ramped up bond buying. So we did a lot to ease financial conditions. We're going to have to eventually sunset, as we weather this pandemic, we're going to have to sunset these extraordinary actions. And it's just a question over what timetable. And so to the point, I believe that in the fullness of time, there'll be periods in our future where interest rate cuts are still a valuable thing to do. But right now we're sitting at as you said, the effective lower bound. We've taken other extraordinary measures. It's not that there aren't other things the Fed can do, but monetary policy has acted in an extraordinary way. And I think the path from here is going to have more to do with, we'll have to see what happens with fiscal policy, but more than that, it's going to have a lot more to do with the path of the virus. There's no getting around it. And how well we wear masks, social distance, follow the health protocols, what happens with a vaccine. How we manage the virus is probably the primary economic driver that's going to determine what happens next. It won't be, as important as monetary policy will be, and it will have a role to play at the forefront of this, is how will we manage this virus. There's no getting around it.
Thank you. Next question will be from Eric Rochal.
Okay, there we go. Thank you. So my business is fortunate. We're a digital business, and we're working on a fiber project specifically to readapt, right? Huh. And I was talking to a young gentleman who was a recent high school graduate who was working on that project. Prior to the pandemic, he was running audio cables. He got laid off, couldn't feed his family, and got this job, and he was currently being trained to run fiber cables. So the question is, have you considered any strategies around digital infrastructure that would both address the digital divide, but also create jobs in the short term?
Yeah, so the answer is absolutely. It's not, the Fed's role, by the way, what we can do, we can be a convener among businesses, nonprofits, educational institutions, and we play that role actively. And Alfreda Norman, who did the introduction, she with a substantial team, and I'm actively involved with them. This is a major priority for our bank. So we do research on these issues, and we convene groups. We don't give money. We're not a donor, but we can be a catalyst for getting projects to be done and highlight how these affect the economy. And we are actively doing that. We have a new initiative called, I won't go through too much, Advance Together, where we're doing all 6 different projects within the state of Texas, distributed throughout the state, that get at some of various issues, but what this type of issue you just described is one of them. And that's the way the Fed is trying to be a catalyst to mobilize people to work on these things.
Thank you, and thank you for that question. Question from Andrew McKeith.
Yes, hello, Robert. It's Andrew McCreath from the Great White North.
Okay. Hi, Andrew.
Economics 101 has shown that historically, when the public sector runs a deficit, they tap the private sector to finance those deficits. But given the Fed's rather tepid outlook for growth, let alone longer-term growth trends that you spoke about earlier, and the fact that international investors are buying less US Treasury bonds today than they have in the past, I'm kind of thinking that the Federal Reserve is going to be forced to buy a lot more bonds than what the market is currently thinking they're going to. I'm well aware that there's a QE program, going on right now, 80 plus 40 billion a month. But I'm kind of thinking that it's going to have to be extended at least through the end of 2021. And I don't think the market thinks that's what's going to be happening, but I think it is going to happen. What are your thoughts on that?
So the US is fortunate. If you look at rates along the curve, so far, there has been substantial demand for us to be financing all along the curve. 10-year rates, 30-year rates are historically low. Yes, it is true. Part of that is the Fed doing monthly bond purchases, but also part of it is investors in the private sector are buying treasuries. And I guess the way I'd answer your question is, I'm concerned that as we get beyond this pandemic, we're going to have to find ways to moderate our debt growth. And I don't think we can rely unduly on the dollar always being the world's reserve currency. And as you talked about, I think there's the Fed right now during the crisis is playing a role, but I do think it will be healthy for us to be moderating this debt growth in the years ahead. And I think it creates a vulnerability otherwise.
Before we take a final question from Access Career, Rob, in late last year, you were talking about your concern about corporate leverage, and particularly kind of the uptick in BBB and sometimes BBB negative issuance that we were seeing. In this environment, is this more or less of a concern right now?
So what I said last year was that the historic level of corporate debt to GDP wasn't on the one hand a systemic risk, and that in 08-09 we had a systemic risk because the lenders were over leveraged. Yep. And we've addressed that thankfully through tough macroprudential policies, capital and stress testing. But corporate leverage would be an amplifier for like a dull headache. As businesses turn down, if they're leveraged, they won't have as much cash flow to dedicate to the business. And I think we're seeing some of that. That's a reality. And so it's not that it's not a concern. I think it's kind of played out the way we anticipated, and that there's a premium today. If you're a business that is not highly leveraged, it's an enormous advantage. Now the Fed has stepped in and helped bolster the corporate debt market, and so there's been substantial issuance and people have termed out. But no, my views on this haven't changed. We're still going to have to monitor the amount of corporate debt to GDP. To the extent it's excessive, it just means that in a downturn, it amplifies the downturn. Meaning in a downturn, you got to dedicate more of your cash flow to debt service than you do to hiring people and making capital investments. And we're seeing capital investment right now is sluggish. Yep. It's very sluggish. And so it hasn't changed. My view on it hasn't changed.
Your view hasn't changed. Hopefully the situation won't get much worse. I'm going to ask John to take this question while we wait on Access Career.
John, you're going to have to go off mute.
Okay, well, John hasn't unmuted yet, but now we've got, all right, let's try Grayson Brown.
Hi there. I just want to point out, earlier you were talking about literacy and childcare and stuff like that. And so in South Africa, when apartheid ended, literacy rates among income quartiles, there was a drastic difference. And I'm just curious if like I was saying, the question, has deregulation led to an overuse of Federal Reserve tools? Is there a point that, it all depends on our recovery, with the virus, like you've said, how well we do social distancing, but is there a point where we've, Alan Greenspan talked about irrational exuberance, and we've been through these periods before, and where there might be no going back, as in like, not like the end of, monetary system, but like a period where crises aren't the tools that when we apply them to future crises aren't able to work as efficiently as in the past. And we see increasing poverty levels and more debt and
so
a societal issue.
Let me tease some of these parts, because you started with literacy, and literacy isn't a monetary policy issue. It's a structural reform we need, and it's by the way, the state of Texas made a terrific decision a couple of years ago, I believe, and we were involved in at least the discussions of the pros and cons of it, in that making it more possible to expand from half day to full day pre-K and to get at early childhood literacy. We can address this. There are nonprofits in this state, Commit, I'll just throw out, I happen to be involved with them, is one of them, where we've seen if you intervene and direct resources, you can change this, okay? And the state of Texas is improving, and we can improve this in the United States, separate from monetary and other policies. So then an issue unrelated to that is, gee, we've relied so heavily on monetary policy. Is it reducing some of the effectiveness of some of these tools? And I think that's an issue we're going to have to wrestle with. At the moment, I think I commented on it already, and I probably don't have anything to add to what I said before, but I would separate the literacy issue. That's a structural change. All of us on this call can do something personally to help support those efforts, and we can make a meaningful difference in the literacy and education and adaptability of our workforce. And I'm convinced of that.
On that final note around the adaptability of the workforce, there's an increasing number of interesting experiments around universal income or universal basic income. And we have a question here on, do you think universal income would help those facing job losses have the time and the space and the breathing room to adapt to the potentially structural changes we're seeing in the economy?
So I'll separate what you do in a crisis with an external shock and what you do in peacetime, I guess, post-crisis. I think during a period like this, I'll be careful not to stay in my lane, but it's clear that the fiscal policy response has helped groups that have been really suffering through no fault of their own as a result of this pandemic to make ends meet and survive this. I think once we get beyond this pandemic, I personally believe there will be, and I said this earlier, there will be dramatic changes in technology-enabled disruption, but there'll be enough jobs. I'm pretty well convinced. I've changed my view on this as it's evolved. There'll be plenty of jobs, but they will rely on more training, a more literate population, a more adaptable workforce. And so the investment is going to have to be in this whole education ecosystem, but there'll be enough jobs. I personally would rather see us invest the money in beefing up our education ecosystem than, I'll leave it to others, and it's not a Fed decision, but I don't know that universal income is I doubt that that's the answer. I think we'll have plenty of jobs, but people are going to need more training and more education, and we're going to have to help them be more adaptable.
Thank you. And on that appropriately measured note, I'd love to hand back over to Alfredo.
Well, great job. I want to thank Rob and Stacey for the rich conversation, and I would also like to thank everyone who submitted a question during this town hall. The Dallas Fed is committed to our communities and to sharing information broadly. So if you're interested in hearing more from the Dallas Fed, please visit our website at dallasfed.org. And while you're there, you can also opt into events such as town halls and our speaker series, Global Perspectives. Until next time, thank you so much for tuning in. We look forward to engaging with you again in the near future. Good evening.
Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Thanks.